So when we sort of talk about advising, this sort of slide here is kind of, if you can imagine, a sort of sea of concerns that a child may be bringing at any given point. You're worrying about the pandemic, you're worrying about your social fit, you're worrying about grades, you're worrying about self-image, and at any given time, you might have a test on top of it. And there's sort of an assumption that's being made in education that at a certain point, and that point is sort of in the middle school, high school years, that a student becomes more of a self-manager. And this particular theory implies that the student to teacher relationship is far more important during the adolescent years, particularly during elementary school. And as such, the amount of support that we end up offering to preteens and teenagers is far less than we would do on the front end and then on the back end during the college years. And in fact, if we look at some of the research when it comes to advisory practices, there's far more um, for those particular age groups than for the middle and the high school years. And so, but what we actually do know in real practice is that anybody who's dealt with a preteen or dealt with a teenager knows that first of all, that sort of growth and self-management is not linear. There are particulars and peculiarities for whatever kid we may be dealing with. And then there are also factors that are not only internal, but also external. And the world does not sort of scaffold for you depending on your age. There's a boy in school who unfortunately his grandfather passed. The world is not going to scaffold that in consideration of how old he is. He's going to have to deal with that in this particular moment. And so, and anybody who's dealt with a preteen or a teenager knows that, these are years where they're going through rapid development, and that development is physical, that development is emotional, that development is cognitive, that development is social. And all those things make these years challenging. And so and what we also know is that how a student navigates these years has a lot of implications for how they're going to end up self-managing later. And so what has become true, and I think what has happened in a lot of schools in understanding this, is that the role that was usually fulfilled by somebody like a counselor, they realizing that's not sufficient. That's not sufficient for the social emotional needs for each and every student. And so, I think some schools, and Roxbury Latin has adopted this tradition well before, but I think a lot of schools are now filling those counseling needs with teachers, and teachers are pretty good candidates to fulfill those needs. They're already there for the record, and they instinctively have some of the skills that are applicable to this thing that we call advising. And advising is really what I would consider it is sort of helping a student manage the things that you sort of see in front of you. I think it's an assumption that a kid can't handle all these things sort of at once, and just need somebody who's going to help them as they go about their road. It's sometimes offering advice, it's sometimes offering corrections, but really in a lot of ways, it's getting the kid to help manage their own lives. And so when it comes to advisories, I think just about any school would say they have something of advisory in some sort of way. The three things I think you need to look for when you're looking at advisories are the purpose, the structure, and the curriculum. And by purpose, I mean, are the advisories for academic guidance? Are they for emotional development? Are they for fostering group work? Are they for discussing current events? Are they all the above? When it comes to structure, are we talking about individual advising? Are we talking about grouping? How often are these advisory meetings? How much of the schedule and of the school's plan is this? How long are the particular meetings? What's the length of the particular partnerships that happen? And then there's also a consideration of curriculum. First of all, is there a curriculum? How detailed is that curriculum? How prescriptive is it? What's the implementation, the effectiveness, and who's measuring that? But at the core of it, really what's happening is that advisories are really allowing students to build relationships, and they're allowing students to build relationships with at least one adult within the school community, which in some ways gives a student sort of a sense of belonging within the school community. And building those sort of positive relationships we've seen from research has Positive implications such as academic achievement, better social skills, and a better emotional adjustment, particularly for students who are new to the school. And so if I can talk a little bit about Roxbury Latin and some of the things that we do. Before I do, I think it's important that sort of grounded in context. Our model is our model because it works for our school. I think if you were working, for instance, at a bigger school, you might have to do some things differently than we do, and I understand that. And so, grounded in this context, we're a school that's under 300, around 300 students. We are an all-boys school, so I apologize if instead of saying students, I say something like boys, because that's part of our vernacular. But one of the things that's really particular to us is that every student has an advisor. They meet with them weekly, and that's assigned pretty early in your career. In fact, by the third week of school, you should have an advisor, and that's part of our important support structure. And really at the base level is the advisor who really sort of serves as a clearinghouse of sorts. And then the advisor is sort of further supported by a head of grade, which I imagine most schools have in some way, but that head of grade in a lot of ways is responsible for taking care of the group at a sort of macro level and then supporting the advisors as they take care of their individual charges. And then the heads of grades are supported by the dean of students. And I think what you see here with the little break there is sort of the break from the sort of advisory piece to things that I would consider more like counseling. Advisors are not counselors. I think there are times where there are emotional needs that are more acute, and a student has to be referred to somebody who is certified and who has been certified in that sort of work, which advisors typically are not, but advisors can be very helpful as to noticing things that are peculiar and helping with things that like referencing. Likewise, when it comes to things like academic skills, we expect our teachers, and particularly teachers as advisors, to be helpful when it comes to learning management and organization and things of that nature. But we certainly have learning specialists who are more expert in matters such as that, likewise with college. And so at Roxbury Latin, I would say that this is how I would define each of those three pillars of advising. Our major purpose is relationship building, to know a student. And we believe that by knowing a student and having a student get to know you and having a group of parents get to know you and developing a relationship in that way, that a lot of the other things that you see below it not just take care of themselves, or are easier along the path to take care of. And certainly the research, which is, I'm not sure it's causal, but we certainly know that building relationships will help with things like academic achievement. But I will say, as somebody who has been there, when you have developed a relationship, it's much easier then to talk about the academics than vice versa. As far as our structure, I think that's part of the model that I think that's part of the model that makes us pretty unique. We are a school that prioritizes student choice when it comes to their advisor. If you're in the 7th and 8th grade, usually what happens is you will be assigned to an advisor who is or has taught or coached you, so that in your first couple of years of the school, you're sort of having face-to-face contact with somebody who has or has been seeing you on a day-to-day basis, and particularly if we're talking about somebody in the classroom who has a sense of you as a student. But as you reach the high school years, from a predetermined list, we basically allow you to let us know any adult in the community on that list with whom you feel comfortable working with. And from there, you get to also rank your sort of first choice. And then I would say 9 times out of 10, you end up with your first choice, and you definitely end up somebody from the list that you had circled. And so we prioritize school choice, student choice. It is a very individualized and personal relationship. You meet with your advisor individually. Your meetings are about you. The sort of group dynamics, they happen every once in a while, but it's really about you as a person. Those are sort of pretty consistent. When you meet with your advisor, you're basically putting a block on their schedule. At Roxbury Latin, our schedule is such that You may have free periods throughout the day, and basically you try to find a time that would align with your advisor and try to keep that in a consistent basis. And then the length of time varies because we have school choice or student choice. Students each year get a chance to sort of re-up on their choice. And so, me as an advisor had 4 senior advisees. 2 of them I've been with for 5 years. 2 of them I've been with for 2 years. I have 4 junior advisees. 3 of them I've been with for 4 years. 1 of them I've been with for, this is my first year. And then likewise with my sophomores, 1 I've been with for 3 years. 1, this is my first year. And so those relationships can vary over time, and hopefully they build. But I think it's important that if a student decides, this particular relationship wasn't for me, that next year I can sort of move on, no hard feelings. And so, as indicated before, sort of our advisor is sort of the clearinghouse of information. And so if you can imagine a student and the various people in their lives who are going to be wanting information about them, perhaps their teachers and their parents and things like that, and who they want to communicate with. Basically, it's a firm understanding that when in doubt, go to the advisor. The advisor sort of has the full picture when it comes to what's going on in the classroom, what's going on in athletics, what's going on at home. And so if anybody's sort of curious about anything, the advisor is probably the best person to speak to that, knowing sort of the full picture. And I think in a certain sense that gives parents sort of relief of mind of not having to worry about who to contact here, who to contact there. Usually it's to the advisor. And I think it gives teachers a little peace of mind in the sense of they know that there's somebody there who will be negotiating and refereeing for them if that should be the case, and vice versa. And so the advisor really serves as the clearinghouse for the school. And so, what made a meeting look like? So you sort of have once a week meetings. They may be about 25 to 30 minutes long. I put a list here of some things that, might end up being topics. We have an advisor handbook, which sort of lays out the year for sort of each of our grades and some of the things that developmentally they may be concerned about. But, this list I put out here is actually a list that's crafted from my own experience as a student at the school, whether it was in 7th grade and me considering quitting the play because it was too hard for me to get home, and talking that through with my advisor. And that was very helpful because it turned out there was somebody who lived in the same town that I did not know lived in the same neighborhood as me, and we were able to coordinate rides. Or it's, 8th grade year and me deciding that I did not want to do a winter sport, and having those conversations about, okay, let's talk about time management and how that's also going to affect your trajectory. And also the fact that, I think that you would be a great wrestler. I still decided not to do that. Whether it be later on and, having somebody that I actually felt comfortable talking to about, changing family dynamics, like my mother getting married and me not feeling very good about my stepfather. And I don't think there would have been anybody else that I would have actually maybe had that conversation with. And I think, those are things that certainly happen from time to time. You have families and you have parents who come to you and say, would you be willing to talk to, my son about this? Because I don't think he will talk to us about it, but he certainly would to you. And, sort of being that helpful teammate to parents, I think is something I have relished. And then, some other topics that sort of come up from time to time. But really, for me, it's about establishing relationship. Right? There's a finding out of who you are, what you like, and to sort of get them talking. And, for some students, that's going to be harder than for others. But for me, it's not always going to be about academics. There are certainly times where, you just want to talk about Marvel movies with an understanding that that's part of the sort of opening up and being able to express yourself and being able to express the things that you enjoy. And for me, I get to listen, I get to understand a little bit more about their sense in the world, how they spend their time, what they care about, their sort of values, without them feeling as if they're being judged in a particular moment. Because for me, part of the key to advising is sort of to being that extra piece is when they need you, they'll let you know if you've done the job as you're supposed to. We have a couple of times at our school where we're required to have official communications. And so we have report meetings where we gather 4 times a year and really discuss the students. And the head of a grade will sort of have a slate of the particular students they want to talk about, but it's really up to the advisor to sort of, as I've sort of talked about before, to give the broad context of a student. This is who they are. This is what they've been going through. This is what teachers ought to know as we move forward. And any sort of plan that may or may not be developed is largely would end up being in the hands of the advisor. We have a parent conference meeting in November, which is very helpful in just sort of setting the agenda. You know, what are you looking to this year? How can you be helpful? And then at the end of the year, we're about to kick that off. We sort of do a culminating letter to families encapsulating the year, the highs, you know, if there were any lows to point them out, and really sort of things to look forward to, you know, where's been the growth, where else can be areas for growth, which you should be looking forward to next year. And as I mentioned before, you know, this is some of the benefits that we've certainly seen in our research, about advising and the things that, and how they can be incredibly beneficial to students. And then same for Roxbury Latin, you know, some of the tensions for us, particularly since we have student choice and we're meeting individually, it's a time commitment. It's a time commitment. There are going to be times where you feel as if you are doing more advising than you are doing teaching, which sometimes can be a very real tension, because it is real as far as experiencing comfort that a lot of teachers have gotten into the gig with the expectation of being more along the lines of a content teacher. But with the world the way it is, and I think schools recognizing the needs of students, it has been true that what has been asked of teachers has been more so and will continue to increase. But one of the things that is also being asked of them, at least at our school, is to do the sort of advising. And if one, it doesn't feel comfortable doing it, then it's not going to be a fruitful relationship. And so, you know, it's also important that a teacher see themselves in this role as much, if not more, as they do as a teacher, because that sort of experience and that comfort, and the more you do it, the better you get at it, which is, I think, is true for most other things. And then finally, it's the sort of workload, particularly when it comes to student choice. There are times where it will be true that particularly faculty members have more advisees, and that's a workload balance and a workload equity. That is something that we're constantly looking at, we're constantly trying to manage. But particularly when you have that sort of choice and you prioritize that sort of choice, you have to figure out ways that you are going to balance that within the system. Happy to take questions. Happy to talk.
Thank you. If anyone is not comfortable showing their video and voicing their questions, feel free to put them in the chat or direct message myself and Jeff, and we can ask the question on your behalf. Ying?
Hi, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Darian, for this wonderful talk. So I am very passionate about education and about to pursue my master's in education. And I have a question for Darian. So I went to a large school, a large public school that had 400 students per class, and you know, class size is pretty big, was like 20 people, 20 students a class. And I know that you mentioned that what you do works at Roxbury because it's a small school, 6 grades, 300 people, about 50 students a grade. What are your thoughts on how to recreate such a system in large public schools? What needs to change, and what needs to change in this current system to fit the larger system, and what needs to change in the larger system?
Yeah, well, I'll start with working within the larger system, because, you know, I think working outside the large system, I think that's gonna be pretty difficult and something that I probably don't have the power to do. So I would like to consider this from that larger system. And I think part of what you ought to do and think about is how to leverage the community that you have. It is my assumption that regardless of where you are within the school, that the educators within that place are largely there because they have a care for helping students to succeed. And I think you can leverage that particular attitude and that particular energy into re-envisioning the ways that they do that. Sometimes the re-envisioning might be not so much worrying so much about content in the English course or something like that, and taking that time to build community as a group of students intentionally within, say, an English group, or having a group of students in an advisory. I think, particularly if you're talking about a large school, I think it's probably it's going to be much more difficult to have a system in which there is that sort of individual one-on-one attention. But I do think that even still, you can develop group dynamics that will allow students to have more face-to-face time with each other and adults. Because I think one of the larger worries, particularly if you're talking about a middle to larger school, is there are a lot of students that fall beneath the cracks. And what ends up happening always is sort of that barbell effect where your acute students get the most attention, whether they're acutely doing well or acutely doing poorly. They seem to get the most attention, and a lot of people fall between the cracks. And we know very well that everybody's got stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I completely agree that one-on-one attention is needed no matter how large or small the school is. And I also think that with large public schools, I think they have to start treating the teachers' job descriptions differently so that they have more time to do the advising that the students need so much. Thank you.
And I think, and just to piggyback on the job description piece, I think part of the reframing of a job description and prioritizing sort of the student fostering of relationships, I think will also bring in a different clientele, or a clientele with a mindset that would approach the work this way.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So there's
I'm going to answer some of these things in the chat. So as far as teachers we have at the school, we have 46 faculty members. And then on top of that, we have some non-teacher staff. I would probably say there were probably about a dozen people who on top of the teaching staff would do some advising. Largely our advisors are coming from our teacher pool, but we certainly, and so, for example, our head varsity basketball coach who does some teaching with the 7th graders, but largely does the basketball role. He has about 3 advisees or things like that, but the large bulk will be coming from our teacher faculty. Greatest lesson I've learned between advising and teaching as in separate. I mean, one of the things that I sort of put into tandem is just the patience that is required when it comes to both of them. I think I learned the patience when it came to teaching, just learning sort of the arc and not trying to gauge my success with a particular class too early. And I think I had to learn that when it came to advising. And I've been thankful that there have been some advisees who have weathered that storm sort of with me, particularly when I can think of a boy that I started working with in the 8th grade, and we would have sort of 30-minute meetings, and it would really be in that last sort of 3 minutes that he would actually start talking and actually saying anything, and then the bell would ring and he would get out of there. And you would leave those sort of meetings and you would just feel like, okay, I'm not sort of making any headway. I'm not getting anywhere. And then the next thing you know, in the 9th grade, he's on your list and you're just saying, how did this happen? But he comes back, he's more comfortable, you're more comfortable, you're sort of trying to figure out how this dance works a little better, and things start to open up a little bit. So, I think it's been patience with myself, never trying to force the issue with the student, letting them develop on their sort of own pace, and making it more about them as well. I think there was a time when I was working at the school, and I will be very honest, I know the school, I'm affectionate of the school, I love the school, but I think there was a time where I was sort of doing the advising for the school. And I think I've also learned how to do the advising for the kid in the school. You know, I'd recommend any books or resources for teachers to learn how to be a better advisor. I think most of the resources that I would say, as far as being a better advisor, are anything that has to do with deep listening. I think anything that has to do with deep listening or asking good questions is essentially where you want to go. I think a book that was very helpful for me, and I think yet again, depending on your clientele, but was a book called "He's Not Lazy" by Dr. Adam Price. And that really sort of helped me see some students who, you know, I used to frame as, you know, not living up to their potential, and you would have a particular narrative in that way. That helped me sort of slow myself down and rethink how I was talking to that kid and what he may be going through and experiencing, and how he may be expressing himself. And so I think that book was incredibly helpful to me.
I think you're muted, Chris.
I'm sorry. Yep, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, hardware muted. Can you talk a little bit more about parents and their acceptance of the program, and how you work with them, and then also the role of technology in any of this? Because so far you like, it's all been very interpersonal. That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start with the parents. Well, you're trying to, it depends on the particular group of parents, but, part of it is you're part of an ecosystem. And I think the flow of information from parent back and forth is really important. And I think parents are very helpful when you can sort of be upfront with them about, let's set the agenda together. What are the sort of things you're looking forward to this year? Where are the particular tensions? And I think when you're just open and honest about those sort of things, they sort of just tell you. There are going to be times when it comes to parents that the particular tensions, whether it be college or whether it be a particular grade that's going well, that those things are strained a little bit. But I think in developing a relationship in early communication, and that's what I always think about, is early communication with parents as to, what it is that you're seeing and what it is that you're thinking about over the course of the year, I think is incredibly helpful. When it comes to, the use of technology in this, that's a good question. Because you're right. I mean, a lot of what we are doing is incredibly interpersonal. I think, part of what I'm thinking about when it comes to the technology is, there are things that we do in order to make some of the processes just more efficient, whether it be particular ways of having kids do choice rather than on paper, whether it be surveys that I give to students in order for me to collect data about, what it is you're in for this relationship, whether it be the way that we are going about doing the processes of sending documents like the letters that I talked about back and forth in order to be edited cleanly and smoothly and then sent off to parents, or even in this sort of pandemic year, I think Zoom has been an absolute blessing as far as our advising has been, because it has opened up the frame in which the timings that you can meet with kids. And I think it's been incredibly important, particularly being able to respond sort of in the moment to those things where, as I said, like when they need you, they will let you know. And so, having a sophomore whose grandmother passed away, and just him shooting you an email saying, can we jump on a Zoom? And having that ability in order to do that, and not having to wait until our meeting on next Wednesday to go about doing that. And so I think things of that like that have been incredibly helpful, because certainly when it came to communication via like things like text, there are things that you certainly draw a line. I email but I don't text. And so I think that Zoom interface has been incredibly helpful as to continue to establish that sort of personal relationship, even though you're far away, but not sort of crossing that professional boundary.
Oh, thank you.
Has my advising added to my personal job satisfaction and ability to fulfill your mission as an educator? Yeah, I think so, because I think the job of advising has really, really helped me just understand students as human beings more. You know, when I first entered the job, my primary focus was on the material and how I was going to impart the material to kids. And I think I have come around in a certain sense of having a better my job is to understand kids and help them learn material. And I think the advising piece is being incredibly helpful to that, because you get to hear from them. They tell you in a way that, you know, they might not actually tell somebody else. And so, for example, you know, there are times where they come in and they just talk about the stress that they're feeling, and like, this class is loading up on me and stuff like that. And you hearing it, and you get a sense of what they're really going through. And I think it's helpful in you making adjustments as an educator on the fly and systematically.
I had a question about, and I think you talked a little bit about it earlier, of what has your experience been with students who don't see the value in this advisory model, and how do you either get them on board, or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, yeah, because sometimes it's slow going for some kids, and to be frank, there are probably times where you look back on a relationship and say, you know, that probably didn't quite take as well as I would have liked. You know, I think on the first part, I think, you know, what do you do? I think you always just sort of retry. You sort of keep coming back, because I think in some ways, at the very least, a student knowing that you're there is incredibly important. And I think some of what has happened is the fact that a student may have felt like they haven't needed you in that sort of way in their time at the school, and so therefore haven't tapped you in that way. And for me, I think in some ways you have to make your peace with that, so long as they're okay, because at the end of the day, it's about them and them being able to manage. And so if they've made the decision that they can manage, then all the best to them. Now, I think there are certainly some kids who may come to that decision, and it turns out I'm not entirely sure that you can manage. But that's also part of their journey, and that's also part of their process. And I think the best you can do is continue to be there.
Just a clarification, because I know you mentioned that school choice or their choice is really important. They cannot choose not to have any advisor.
They cannot.
That's correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Pros and cons, 8 to 12 school, all boys. That's okay. I think the biggest pros and cons have to do with you and your child. And I think it all ends up boiling down to what do you think is right for your school? I think we're blessed to be, or, you know, I'm going to speak from where I'm at. I mean, I think if we're in Boston, I think we're blessed to have a number of different options that are available in order to educate our children. And I think with that smorgasbord, you have to make the decision that seems to make the most sense for your child. And so, you know, if I'm saying about pros, you know, I think the pros are, you know, in the sense of, if you're talking about an all boys education, and that's something that you believe in the sense of, you know, that gendered school and what it means to grow from a boy to a man, and how can you do that while also detoxifying yourself of some of the things that we've learned about masculinity. I think there are places that probably do that pretty wonderfully. With that being said, I think one of the cons is exactly also in the name, right? It's a sort of singular environment. It's an environment that doesn't allow for much back and forth with girls, with others, and that's something that has to be acknowledged, and has to be in some ways dealt with either by the school or at a later time. And so I think, you know, the pros and cons largely have to do with exactly what the school is and what they purport themselves to be. I think the particular age levels, I don't necessarily buy into this idea. I mean, I think it's true because we've made it true that about the developmental differences between boys and girls. I think we've made that to be true, but I think we've seen plenty of schools that can put them together and do just fine. I think we've seen plenty of examples of schools that can take them apart and do it well. I think it has to largely do with your philosophy as a school and why you are having that separate environment.
Do you think Roxbury Latin would ever be a multi-gendered school?
I
You don't
say
need to say yes or no. This is
I am going to
difficult.
say 366 years of all boys. I think they're probably going for 367 next year. Well, I will say, so I'll give an example from yesterday. Maybe this isn't exactly during advising, but yesterday we had an opportunity as a school to sort of conduct an open space in order to talk to each other about how we were feeling given the Derek Chauvin trial, and this being an opportunity to sort of pause and reflect on what's going on in the world. And I was leading that session, and one of the things that I thought was really important during that session was that we at this school don't take time or not time to intellectualize things. I think we do plenty of that during the 9 to 5, and I thought this was an important time that we took the time to feel, took the time to ask each other questions, took the time to let people ask questions without feeling the pressure to have the answers. And that's something that I sort of walked into. So I walked into a group of 50 people and let them know how I was feeling, and had a conversation thereafter with our school kids and our 7th graders, and let them know about the anxiety that I feel about even having this conversation with a group of 12-year-olds and sort of taking away part of their innocence in doing that. And one of the things I was amazed about from the 7th graders is, I'm trying to open up this conversation for them. And, when I asked them, what kind of questions do you have? The questions were like, what were you doing? What were you watching? What were you? And, they're bouncing it back to me, and they want to know more in that sort of way. And I think it's the modeling. So I think I would think that would be an example of modeling and doing that, and sort of giving the implicit permission that, it's okay to feel, which I think is also incredibly important, particularly with a group of young boys.
I think going off that point a little bit, I know you mentioned there's like a curriculum. So along with this idea of it's okay to feel, is there other things that are part of that curriculum that you try to teach, or is it only like listening and having them process? And
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, our advisors also sort of the clearinghouse of what we would call "quote unquote" character education, which I think is sort of twofold, right? It's the character piece as far as virtue ethics, right? So you're talking about things like honesty, you're talking about things like respect, which are probably our 2 major pillars within the school, but then also sort of what I think others would frame as the soft skills. And so that would be things like, your organization, and a big one for us would be things like self-advocacy. And so, I think just about so for example, a thing like self-advocacy, that's a really important trait at RL. And so that's and from the time that a child is in 7th grade, something that we're trying to instill with them. And so if they come back, for example, with a quiz and saying, I don't like how I did on this, yada yada yada, one of the things that the advisor will help them with is, okay, so what are you going to do? How are you going to approach this? Do you want to talk to the teacher? How are you going to do this? And sort of instilling within them, right, that sort of giving them the sort of tools in order to do that. And so, yeah, I think maintaining within the pillars of our school, which largely have to do with, respect, honesty, and I think other things that I think you can imagine from most schools, but then also being on the lookout for some of those soft skills. And I think a major one for us is advocacy and sort of taking the reins over of your life.
anyone else have any questions?
I have another, and hopefully this time I'm not muted.
No,
You're good.
you're good.
I don't want to take us too far off topic, but can you talk a little bit more about the role of the learning specialist and how you know when to encourage a student to continue the conversation with you versus encouraging them to talk to that specialist?
Yeah, and so largely, I think you get some, you get some of the data, right? You see the grades, you have the conversations, you talk to teachers, and you have an understanding of there might be something askew here. And I think that conversation largely happens between advisor and the head of grade as to, okay, is there something here that needs to be taken to a learning specialist, who would then also take a look at the case and understand the data and make that sort of assessment. I think the advisor's role largely in that is sort of that conversation when it happens, right? That conversation that you're going to, we're recommending that you see Ms. Dromgold's her name at our school. And I think with that, that's an incredibly important piece, because as you can imagine, right, I think different kids will handle such news in different ways. I think some kids are incredibly grateful for the opportunity and somebody noticing that. And I think some kids see that and say, okay, you're saying that I'm lacking here. And I think an advisor is incredibly important in helping with that conversation. And in the same way, we typically don't have that conversation between advisor and advisee when it comes to seeing the school psychologist, but we certainly would have it between an advisor and the parents. And yet again, they could be incredibly helpful in sort of building that bridge and understanding of why this is important and why this is a good thing.
Darian, if I could just jump in for a minute here, because I wanted to address Chris's previous question about technology, and I was just thinking about the slide that you had about sort of the difference between advising and counseling. I think just by its nature, advising is very much a one-to-one, interpersonal activity. We do have some more technology around the counseling pieces. So the learning specialist has some communication channels that we've built out for her in our learning management system and student information system, and we've got some similar things for the college office as well. So just to note that the technology piece is there, but it's I guess it's more facing the counseling aspects.
There's a question from Dave about which do I enjoy more. I think it's sort of similar to the question that I get from kids often, like which class do you enjoy more? And the way I usually answer them is, it depends on the month, it depends on the week, it depends on what y'all are up to. And I think that certainly is the case. I think I enjoy both of them because they're both challenging and they force me to learn more. And I think the things in my life that have asked me to do those things are things I really enjoy. But then there are also going to be times where sometimes the advising is tough. Sometimes it is really tough, and I would prefer to retreat to the classroom, and then vice versa. There are some times where the advising is just a pleasure. So I think there are waxes and wanes, but overall, they both force me to learn more in order to do it better, which I appreciate. In the future, you expect to take more of the teaching in grades and teachers do more advising? I wouldn't say take over the teaching. I would probably say more like, I think teachers will, I think teachers and technology will have a better synergy. I hope that that the teachers see and experiment and utilize technology in ways that are going to assist them in the classroom, because I think two things are true. Kids want to learn, and so you can't get in the way of that. That's probably the worst thing you could do, is get in the way of that. But I think you can always buoy learning by the relationships and the passion that it can draw out. And I don't think there's going to be a substitute for that. I had a philosophy professor who once told me that, regardless of how you look at it, teaching and learning is intimate experience. And I think of that every single time that, you know, I move on to another class and the previous class comes up to me and say, oh, hey, are they better than us? Hey, how they're doing? Have they got, right? There's a relationship that they feel. There was a moment in time that I don't think can be replicated. And so I think there is always going to be that tension and that balance as to what exactly we're asking teachers to focus on.
How do you really balance the advising with like all the other demands of a teacher? At least, you know, maybe because the student to teacher ratio is a little better at Roxbury Latin, but teachers are always overworked, and they, you know, how do you fit it into your schedule?
By being overworked. I mean, I think there is going to be a reality as far as teaching. I mean, I don't know a teacher who doesn't feel as if they're doing a lot. And I think it's part of the care ethics of being a teacher that you're going to want and to do more. I think the hope is that you're feeling fulfilled and not burnt out by that doing. But the ways that the school can help is schedule matters, right? How you spend your time is what you care about. And so, you know, I think if anybody's trying to think about an advising system that's going to be considerable, you have to think about how much time are you allowing to be carved out and how much time are you actually carving out for it.
Are Roxbury Latin teachers a part of a teachers union?
You're not. I like flipped classrooms. I certainly do plenty of it. Allow my students to watch a video and then come in and do some work and ask questions. Certainly did that for my, that was the experience for my Greek classroom today. Yet again, I don't think it sort of replicates the interpersonal piece, but I do think it's a way of giving students another option of doing the work. I think we get to the best place where it's not just about necessarily watching videos, but having a smorgasbord of information that's all equally good and basically saying, hey, we have this topic, here are some things that are available to you to learn it, let's start to figure out what works best for you. And I think things like flipped classroom have helped that process go a long way.
I had a question about, I guess either the handbook or the curriculum, in that there are going to be those situations, you know, you mentioned that you are not equipped to do, maybe around like mental health or learning disabilities. Does the handbook or the curriculum teach you how to like guide those students to those resources? Especially, you know, on the mental health piece, there's still a lot of people who are not willing to access those resources. Mm-hmm. So do they teach you how to, you know, guide them in that direction?
So the particular advisor wouldn't necessarily have to do that work, but if the advisor, say, noticed something, or somebody or a group of people noticed a student with, and it felt like it warranted seeing some outside counseling, then we do have mechanisms for that to go into place. And so we have a team of people at the school, and myself included, that would sort of take a look at this. We have a school psychologist that we contract with, but really once that's sort of been put into the channels, the advisor doesn't need to do much else. It's other people who have been trained and have more experience who will sort of do the negotiation between parents, student, school psychologists, things of that nature. And so the advice, I mean, I guess that's a long way of saying that the advisor certainly has support in their work. and are not necessarily required to be more than an advisor.
Have advisors ever felt they were in conversations that they couldn't handle?
Yeah, I mean, I can say I have been, and it's a difficult moment. And looking on the, it's a difficult moment because you're certainly sometimes in a moment where you don't want to say the wrong thing. You're not prepared for this. But when I look retrospectively, one thing I always say to myself is, well, if you weren't there, or that kid didn't feel comfortable opening up to you, then what? Right? It doesn't change the baggage that we all have with us. And I think one of the things that I'm grateful for at the school is, first of all, I think our kids take care of each other. But there have been plenty of situations also where, a kid had into another kid and it didn't seem right. And that kid's sort of walking around like, what do I do about this? And, usually they know, if I have that question, I talk to my advisor. And I certainly have gotten a phone call, email saying, this happened and maybe doesn't seem right. And thankful that they have. So I think those things are real. And, I think regardless of where you are, you're going to be in situations where you're not necessarily ready for that. But I think I'm grateful for the fact that even still, somebody felt that they were somebody they trusted. Let's see. Are you experiencing or are you expecting or preparing for any challenges when students start returning to life as normal after COVID, or that you have seen because of COVID? I think the COVID environment at our school, and I think at a number of other schools, I think people are tired, people are lonely, people are anxious. Sometimes it feels like a rat race, and I think that the kids feel it as much as the adults, and I think that has been depressing. I think there's an expectation that once the sort of world opens up, that those emotions will go away, and I'm not terribly sure about that. And so that's, if there's a concern of mine, that's the one. Benefits of Greek or Latin. And again, I think it depends on you and depends on what you want and depends on what you're looking for. I'm not going to say that the benefits of learning Greek and Latin is something like higher SAT scores, although that's true. I mean, I think the benefits of Greek and Latin is the benefits of taking Greek and Latin. And if you're interested in reading what some people had to say some time ago in a particular language, then it's all for you. I will say that I am a person who is curious as to what Socrates has to say about wisdom. Not everybody is.
Miggy, did you have a question? I noticed you're unmuted. Okay. No problem. Just wanted to make sure we got you if you had anything. You mentioned something earlier about deep listening. Do you want to? I'm interested to hear more about that and how that has really affected your work.
Yeah, I think it's just I think part of it came from part of my studies at St. John's, which was really sort of a grad school that was built on conversation and helping me sort of take the time to listen to people. I think the work at some of the work I did at Columbia, I think it was just really important in the sense of like, when I think of deep listening, it's listening, not trying, doing your best not to have the sort of inner dialogue going and allowing person to sort of complete their thoughts. And I think what has helped me do is to hear the song behind the music. I think there are often times that somebody is saying something to you, and I think if you're just sort of hearing what's sort of coming out their mouth, it could be really, really hard because it takes you on a divergent path, but sometimes you got to sort of hear what's behind that. And I think deep listening has really helped me hear some of the emotions, some of the feelings, give me an opportunity to look at body language a lot more than I was in the past, which I think has just been incredibly helpful in sort of, for me, getting, helping kids see the root, which is yet again, I think, partially important because, it's their path and sort of helping them see where they are. Deep listening be similar to meditation. I'm not a great meditator, so so I'm not sure about that, but I imagine that it could be helpful in the sense of helping you sort of just be in the moment. And I think we often sort of times take ourselves out of the moment and think about ourselves and what we did at some other point when we're hearing somebody else talk. And I think something like meditation could possibly be helpful in reminding us to just be in the moment and whatever's happening to sort of let it be. And so I think if that's helpful to you, go for it. But I think the difference between hearing and listening in some ways, sort of what I was talking about, hearing the sort of cacophony of noises, but really sort of listening and seeing what's the pattern beneath it and whether or not these noises you're hearing have any sort of pattern to them. And I think some of it comes from, even allowing yourself to ask questions and ask somebody to repeat themselves or to repeat back to somebody what you think that you heard, right? I think I heard this. And I think that also, I think that also allows, another opportunity to listen.
Sorry, I didn't have this meeting. Wow.
Cool.
Another question about Greek and Latin. The way I would answer that as specifically as possible is if you were reading Socrates in English, then you are reading somebody else.
Did that answer your question, Dave?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm still struggling to understand that answer. It seems to me if it's a good translation, it should be Socrates' actual ideas, not the ideas of the translator. So I just don't see, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just don't understand the benefit of being able to actually read the Greek.
I guess the way I'll say is that translation, regardless of whatever mechanism you're using, is actually a very difficult trade. And I think one of the things that comes with translation and the assumption of translation is that particular words and ideas have a perfect carryover between one language and another, which is not necessarily the case given The fact that, Greek is Greek is not English with different letters. They are completely different systems, born of a different time and different values and different cultures. And there's just some things that are not going to be understood perfectly in one way through the other. And the problem is when it comes to purely translation, translators have to make decisions. And when it comes to decision making, whether it be words or phrases or clauses, those carry weight. And those carry weight throughout your particular translations. And so the translator, by translating, is making value judgments on the work that may or may not be what Socrates was purporting.
Would I be able to add a little bit more about the significance of like language in different texts and the importance of that?
Yeah,
So okay, thank you. I speak about 3 languages, and sometimes there are words that I want to say, let's say in English, that I know in Spanish, or there are words that I know in French that that there isn't a direct translation for it in English. And so it's really hard to describe that word or that feeling. And so sometimes like, let's say if we're talking about like the ghettos of Brazil or like the inner cities of Brazil, you're not going to say, oh, the ghettos of Brazil or the hood of Brazil. You're going to say the favela of Brazil, because that gives it more context. And there isn't a direct way to translate the word favela into English, right? And so when we look at text, whether it's ancient Greek or ancient Latin, or looking at the English translation, we also do have to remember that as a storyteller or even as a translator, everyone carries a type of biases, and that is added, and that's a decision that the translator has to make as to what exactly was this person thinking, what is the best way to denote these words into this other language, And then even then, like when we're talking about Socrates, we don't really know what he was thinking, right? We weren't there when he was writing what he was writing, or when somebody was transcribing what he was writing. We can do, even with like history, the best we can do are educated guesses based on the information that we already have until new information gets rediscovered.
Well, thank you, Miggy, for your comments there. It just seems to me that a high school student, to really understand the subtleties of the difference between a favela and whatever a favela means. I mean, that might, I can see if you're a professor or a grad student and you're really into the subtleties of the words, but at the high school level, I would think it's asking a lot of a kid. I mean, even just to get the gist of Socrates's ideas is pretty good at the high school level to be understanding the subtleties of what the words mean in Greek seems pretty advanced, but it's impressive to me. I mean, I didn't even know anyone was doing such a thing, so I'm impressed to learn it's happening out there. But I would think you could get 90% of it from an English translation of Socrates, and maybe miss the last 10%.
But if we're talking about the world of ideas, you don't want to miss the last 10%. I think that's basically the point, right? The point is to get that last 10%, because if these ideas are so damn important, you want to capture it all.
Well, I would say 99%. I mean, I would think the bulk of the vast majority of it you could get from an English translation, and that last whatever fraction of a percent it is, then study that in grad school if you're really that much into it. But I mean, it just seems like a lot of work for a high school kid to learn Greek so they can read what a Greek philosopher writes. I mean, they, instead of learning Greek, they could have read, more Greek philosophers, for example. So there's a trade-off there between, do you read more Greek philosophers, or do you spend the time learning Greek and read fewer of them?
Yep, and I think at least for us, the students who choose to take Greek are happy to sort of study deeply and take that route.
Okay, that's great. That's very impressive to me.
We have about 10 minutes left. Anyone have any final interesting questions they want to talk about? Anything you really want to talk about, Darian, that you haven't covered already?
I think I got a good wide breadth of talk, which I think is a wonderful thing. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate being able to talk about this, particularly with an EdTech group, and being able to sort of certainly I think, and particularly with your question, Chris, it's not something that was sort of at the forefront of my mind about how we are doing this work and leveraging our technology for that, but I think that helped me move the needle.
Well, we want to thank you again for coming here. We will be here if anyone wants to chat after. I'll stay here till 8. I'm sure Darren will. I don't want to speak for him, but he'll stay the extra 10 minutes if someone wants to have a more intimate conversation. But thank you everyone again for attending. Jeff, can you drop the link in the chat to the survey? As I mentioned, it is a work in progress. We are really trying to define what this survey means for us and how we are going to use it. So we appreciate as much feedback as people can give, because I know it's not perfect. So thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you at the next event.
Thanks for having me. I was happy to stick around.
Thanks, Darren.
Okay, I want to ask another question. So how many years does it take for a student to be able to learn enough Greek to read Socrates?
So at least in our program, our students who would like to take Greek will start in their sophomore year. And I would say that they would start the process of reading the Republic probably about a month ago in their second year.
So is the teaching done, I mean, are they learning it the way you learn English, where you're kind of learning vocabulary words, kind of the way that you learn like Spanish if you were taking Spanish, or is it taught different from more commonly used languages?
Yeah, I think, certainly an emphasis on doing things like reading and translating rather than on speaking and having conversations. certainly that would be probably feel a little different. But as far as things like vocabulary acquisition, sentence structure, I think those will probably feel pretty similarly. I think, well, I think first of all, since these our students are taking an introductory language, if they choose to take Greek as a sophomore, you know, we're going to treat them like they're sophomores rather than for, say, our 7th or 8th graders who are would be taking their first year of Latin or a modern language. But I think also there is certainly a scaffolding that occurs. And so you're not wrong in the sense that if after this is all said and done, Greek is something you want to pursue more so, yeah, there's probably going to be some other things that you're going to need to do because there is some sort of scaffolding in order to get you to reading a little sooner.